Welcome to History on Drugs. I'm kicking off season 3 talking about drugs and alcohol and the part they played in the American Revolution. Before I get into the war, I want to read the first sentence of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which went viral. It was like a bestseller essentially in 1776 that motivated and inspired the populace, the colonists, to say things like liberty and freedom and to, fight tyranny. Perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right and raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of custom. So what Thomas Paine is saying there, like, you only believe things that are wrong because you don't know any better, right? And this was the first line on the way to freedom. So today, this is not 100% a historical tutorial on the Revolutionary War. I'm going to talk about some of the things that happened leading up to the war, and then we'll do like a broad stroke of the war, but talk about the role that alcohol played in it, and then we're going to end on how opium became so prevalent in the military hospitals and the pharmacopoeias that were created with instructions of how to dose and treat soldiers would be used like 80 years later, 70 years later, in the Civil War, and ultimately lead to America's first opiate epidemic, which if you haven't checked that episode out, I think it's season 1 on Spotify or YouTube. So let's look at the colonies. It's 1750 in the American colonies. We got 13 colonies. They all have a little autonomy, and they elected their own leaders, the House of Burgesses Assembly. They had their own levies in place. The economies were flourishing for some, of course, not for others. In the southern colonies, slavery was prevalent. For instance, South Carolina, 60% of the population were slaves, and they were producing indigo and rice. And that was their big export that kept the rich rich in South Carolina. In Virginia, 40% of their population were slaves. And tobacco was the big crop there that kept the rich rich. In the New England colonies, which is relevant to what we're talking about today, one of the biggest products, not only for their economy, but would actually fill the foundation of the whole darn thing, was rum. That's right, alcohol. And why was it so important? Well, for one, 250 years ago, it was very common to mix water with alcohol just to kill the bacteria. They've been doing it since ancient times. It was safer to drink. They weren't sure why, but it's what they did. But that's not the way we're talking about using it. Rum was such a commodity, it was used as a currency. You could trade like land for it. You could trade all kinds of goods and services. And sadly, you could put the rum on a ship out of Boston, go to Europe, sell some of the rum, make some money, take the ship down to West Africa, trade some of the rum for humans, for slaves. Load on the slaves, maybe trade some rum for slaves and sell some too. Then head to the West Indies, where we would sell some slaves to the planters down there because they were producing the sugar cane and molasses that the colonies needed to produce rum. So we would trade the slaves for more ingredients or sell some, and then stop at Charleston, sell some slaves to the southern planters because they couldn't get enough slaves to help drive the demand for their products, plus the ambition of going west, which we'll talk about in a second. Then they would take that ship back to Boston. So the rum trade, New England colonies, fish, lumber, and rum were their big products. But rum obviously was so important for many other reasons because it kept the whole thing going. Now, we had a two-class system back then. There was the haves and the have-nots. And a lot of the wealthy elites, including George Washington and Ben Franklin, they were invested in land deeds west of the Appalachians, right, in the Ohio River Valley, which was Indian territory. There was like 6 tribes there, plus the French were in that area. The southern wealthy elite were also invested there. Why? Because one of the real reasons we went to war wasn't just the taxes, it was we had limited ability to expand the ambitions of the wealthy colonists. Everybody was invested in land in the Ohio River Valley. And what happens next would put an end to that. And that would really piss off the elites, which you don't want to do in a society running on capitalism. So ultimately, the French and Indian War would start in the mid 1750s. The British would go to war with France, and some of the Indians joined the French, some of the Indians joined the British, and of course, the American colonists joined the British. George Washington wanted to be an officer in the British Army, but the British Army did not let colonists rise to the ranks of officers. So he participated, and we'd fight in the French and Indian War, what the rest of the world calls the 7 Years' War. And when that war ended in 1763, the Crown, Britain, they were broke. Wars are costly. And Parliament and the Crown were like, hey, we just fought a war for 7 years defending the colonies against Indians and the French, and we're broke. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leave a bunch of those troops there. So the British leave 10,000 redcoats, including officers and different officials in the colonies. That costs a lot of money. The interest on their debt alone was like $5 million back then. Imagine what that was today. So leaving those soldiers, they also set up the proclamation line saying nobody can go past the Appalachian Mountains. And everybody's like, what? We're invested in land there. We're expanding. What do you mean we're not going past it? Sorry, all those land deeds, they're worthless. So we're going to keep these redcoats here to manage you, to make sure you don't go out west, and to make sure you do some other things that we need to do because we're broke. And that is, we need to not only issue taxes, it's time we enforce taxes. So since 1733, there was a tax on the rum trade, right? There was the Molasses Act. And basically, it taxed the imports of sugarcane and sugar from the West Indies, but it wasn't enforced. The colonists didn't pay it. They had their own routes and smuggling routes in place for like 50 years. But now in 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. And this was a new tax on the ingredients of rum, except for, guess what? They now had all these troops and officials here. They were going to enforce it. And by enforcing the Sugar Act, they would have custom officials, Royal Navy blockades. They were intercepting smugglers. They were searching ships. And there were fights. And people really got pissed off in the colonies and fought back. You were disrupting the foundation of everything, the alcohol industry, particularly in Boston, where, as you know from history, that's where everything goes down. So the Sugar Act, dismantling the rum industry, had a lot of cause and effect issues. One, yes, it pissed off the locals. Two, it put a tax in place. Three, it motivated groups like the Sons of Liberty to form to say, no, we're not paying taxes. We can't have all these troops here. What do you mean we can't go west? What are these people telling us how to live? What is that? That's tyranny. So they started producing pamphlets and political cartoons, like making fun of King George. And then ultimately the Sugar Act would be repealed, but then the Stamp Act would come, and that would be a tax on anything that involves paper. So a series of taxes would start to be put in place, then repealed, then a new tax from 1764 all the way up to like the war, really, in the 1770s. But in like 1768, things had gotten so heated with the focal point around Boston that the British Parliament was like, we can't control these colonists. They're literally tar and feathering the tax collectors. They're burning down buildings. They're staging protests. There's violence in the streets. We need to send more troops. And by sending more troops, they just pissed off the populace even more, because now all the poor people that live in the colonies really gave a shit about the land out west. They didn't have money. They weren't invested in it. But the wealthy class was like, hey, man, it's now 1768. Like, we need to go west. We want to expand this continent. We want it. So delegates from different colonies started meeting. They fire off some letters to King George. He ignores them, of course. And then things start to steamroll rapidly. And in 1770, we would have the deadliest snowball fight in the history of the world, as we know it, the Boston Massacre. And this was just another situation where the troops were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You had a bunch of drunk colonists coming out of taverns, politically motivated, pissed about tyranny, and they start fighting and taunting the British troops. Ultimately, these young British troops are cornered. They're scared. They shoot. They kill 5 colonists. Now people died. It becomes a big deal. The tensions in the colonies started getting out of control. And then the answer was always send more troops, send more troops. And then eventually in the early 1770s, we'd have the Boston Tea Party, because a series of boycotts would lead up to us dumping all the tea into the Boston Harbor. And these boycotts of products coming from Britain and not buying from loyalists, which were people in the American colonies that were loyal to King George, we stopped buying products from any of them, and it crippled their industry. Okay. And our smuggling routes were trying to get more creative, but they were still being constricted. So the Parliament and King George's idea to put all these taxes on the colonies, bring more troops, just kept costing more money, and they weren't generating the revenue they thought. And then ultimately, this would kick off with the Boston Tea Party, which actually there were tea parties in Boston, Charleston, and Greenwich. Boston just, it's the rock star of the tea parties, right? Where they dress up as Indians, throw all the tea in the harbor. It was the East India Company's tea. They were pissed. They're like a too big to fail kind of company for Britain. And now everybody was angry. Tensions are mounting. Guess what the answer is? Hey, we're going to install military governors and officials in the states. We're going to run a military state, and we're going to send more troops. So war is inevitable. Tensions are mounting and rising. There's just crazy protests, right? John Hancock's, he imports Madeira wine. It gets locked down in the Boston Harbor, so he loses tons of money. So the Sons of Liberty pull a boat of a customs official up out of the harbor and burn it. And so many things just started going foul. And then, of course, we have Lexington and Concord. So as Massachusetts turned into a military state, they knew the colonists, militias were getting together. They knew the colonists were talking and plotting and planning. So they were marching out to Lexington and Concord to find the ammunition and the guns that could potentially be used to kill them. And this is where we get the famous drunk driving incident from Paul Revere, right? He goes from tavern to tavern drinking, the British are coming, the British are coming, which would be really confusing because we were all British still at the time. So people would be like, yeah, I know the British are coming, you're British. So Lexington and Concord happens. The Redcoats, they shoot. I forget. It was over 100 Americans die, or 100 British soldiers die. But then the militia started showing up as the Redcoats were retreating. They started picking them off behind rock walls and trees, and things got violent. This would lead them back to Boston. And at the same time, our Congress, which was not the Congress of the colonies, it was the Continental Congress. Do you see what I'm getting at? Continental, meaning the Ohio River Valley and lands up north and lands down south. The colonists had greater ambitions than just being 13 colonies fighting about taxes. They wanted the land to grow capitalism. That was the way society was heading. So at this time, the Congress was putting together war plans, how to get supplies. Ben Franklin's over negotiating with France. Hey, we need your help. We need weapons. We need ammunition. We need guns. So they send Benedict Arnold, everybody's favorite hero, to Fort Ticonderoga. He teams up with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. They take over the fort without incident. The only incident really is the Green Mountain Boys end up drinking 90 barrels of rum, which pisses off Benedict Arnold so much he writes them up. And so Congress has to apologize, and they reimburse for the rum. So you got the hungover Ethan Allen boys and Benedict Arnold not getting along. Eventually, Henry Knox will take the weapons from Fort Ticonderoga, which were cannons, ammunition, an amazing trip to Massachusetts through the Berkshires. Now, George Washington eventually will roll up there, but not until Bunker Hill happens. So while all this stuff is going on behind the scenes, the militias gathered by the thousands on Breed's Hill, right next to Bunker Hill in Boston, The Royal Navy starts shooting cannons. Like 3,000 redcoats start marching up the hill, and the colonists just start picking them off one by one. So ultimately, they'd run out of ammunition, the colonists, and the redcoats would win the land, but they would lose the day. And by that, I mean they had almost 1,200 casualties. So almost half of the soldiers that put a foot on the ground on Bunker Hill for the redcoats would be killed or injured in that battle. And that would be the deadliest battle for Britain all the way up until World War I. So even though they drove us out of there, they had morale was low. They were devastated. They were like, how can this happen? Why are these colonists killing us? What are we going to do? What's our strategy? Now GW rolls in, gets the Henry Knox cannons. They aim them on Boston. They kick the British out of Boston. The American colonies rejoice. Everybody's happy at this time, right? Everybody's fired up, like, we got this. And of course, the Southern colonies were on board now because, like, the British were like, hey, we'll free the slaves if you come to our side and fight with us. Like, you can't do that. That's their whole economy. So not only are they losing money from not being able to expand out west, now you're going to free their slaves. That pissed off the Southern colonists. So everybody was on board, and now we were going to war. The problem is we didn't have an army. We had a bunch of militias and colonists, some guns, but all we had was GW looking sharp in his military outfit, but he had to, like, build the plane as it was flying. There was no army. We had no supplies. We had no, like, strategies of how to march, set up camp, how to move water and food, how to flank an enemy, how to protect yourself, how to shoot properly. So he basically had to figure all this out as we go along. Now, during this time, Benedict Arnold would take a bunch of troops and head up to Quebec to try to expand the Continental Congress's desires of territory by taking over Quebec. That would be a disaster. Thousands of troops would surrender. Others would die. Benedict Arnold gets injured, but Washington doesn't fare any better. He looks out, coming out of the harbors in New York, and sees the Royal Navy. Now we got like 20,000 redcoats and almost all of Washington's army, which is about 20,000. He has almost everybody in the Long Island area, Brooklyn area there, and then just a regiment over the river, safe. And he almost lost the war right there. It was a disaster. The militia, because they're not an army yet, were getting shot, killed. Many of them were surrendering, and they weren't just surrendering because they were outmanned. For months they had been marching around New England. They had no clothes. They barely had food. The rum supply had been cut off because of the blockades. So it was real tough to be a soldier. And they thought surrendering to the British would actually be better than spending another day with that George Washington. So Washington snuck out of there famously in the middle of the night in the fog. But now the war would be ugly and sad for America for the next couple of years, that there'd be a series of battles where Washington almost loses. He leaves his flank open or something bad, and he's got to retreat. So we do a series of these maneuvers that just weren't effective, but they were effective because George Washington knew we didn't have to win any of this stuff. We just have to outlast them and stay alive, because the British people weren't happy about the war. The Parliament and the King weren't, because it was costly. And, we were a pretty good trade partner when we were getting along. So Washington knew we just got to last. We just got to last. So things get ugly for a little bit. And finally, the military gets it together. They instill their orders of the military. They figure out how we're going to get medical supplies, where we're going to build hospitals. And now this is where some alcohol stuff comes in. Besides it being one of the triggers for the entire war itself, was George Washington had in there that every soldier would get 4 ounces of liquor per day. Ideally, it was rum, but the rum trade was squeezed, and officers could get 2 additional ounces. Those on tough, challenging, and secret missions could also be motivated with 2 additional ounces. Now, Washington loved using the alcohol for a few reasons. One, he thought a little bit of alcohol actually motivated soldiers. It would be good before battle. And then after battle, and from marching long hours and being cold, tired, hungry, depressed, he thought alcohol would be great to boost morale or to soothe them. But too much alcohol, now you're going to piss George Washington off. So he put in the military directive, there would be 30 lashes for people that were insubordinate or drunk or misbehave. And we would know they did, because you can go back and look at advertisements of the time. And advertisements back then weren't like an ad with a picture. It was just like words like spelled wrong, if you ask me. But so many people would desert the army, and they would put a $50 reward out, and Washington would be like, $50. This guy was last seen in a bar. You might find him in a bar. He's drunk. Oh, this guy over here, he stole liquor and left camp, and we're giving a reward. So all of these deserter ads in the paper to have the people bring them back were all describing drunks, right? And that was one big thing. Two, Washington knew that the rum was cut off. We were having trouble getting alcohol to the soldiers just to fulfill the basic rations. And listen, Washington, somewhere in his DNA, I never learned in history, he believes alcohol is a great motivator. Here's a side note. Let's just digress for a second. In 1758, I believe, after he was done fighting in the French and Indian War, he ran for the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and to win the vote, he literally encouraged people to come down and vote, and he was going to supply them with alcohol. So he incentivized 341 people to come drink. He had rum, spruce beer, hard cider, Madeira, port, whiskey. He had it all. And that's how he won the election in Virginia. So George Washington, his DNA uses alcohol to motivate people to do things. So that was from before we were at war. So another thing he did was when British soldiers were surrendering or they were deserting, right? They just left the British Army. They didn't want to be over here anyways. And he would capture them, and he would tell the officers, hey, listen, tell them we'll give them a ration of alcohol, but not until they talk. So all these alcohol directives are actually in the Washington letters and papers and military records. You can go and see, and the ads for deserters asking for alcohol, and it's pretty crazy. And so many court-martial records are also available, and tons of them were just from abuse of alcohol. All right. And so we just had this culture of drinking. Hey, you're at war. We were poor. We were cold. We were tired. We were hungry. Some of these soldiers had no shoes, no shirts, no pants. You know, we go to the Battle of Trenton. It's reported that some of these guys are marching through the snow in a nor'easter, like ice and snow and wind, and they had no shoes, but they're marching with bloody feet through the snow, ripped shirts, half pair of pants, and they still go and take over a fort and win the Battle of Trenton over these Hessians, which were German mercenaries. So these soldiers needed their boost so bad that Washington proposed the next thing that's alcohol related, was that he asked Congress to give them the funding and the logistics to build and plan their own distilleries, because they discovered that rotted corn, grain, and wheat could be used to make whiskey. And since we couldn't get rum anymore, Washington wanted a military distillery just to distill our own whiskey to give it to the troops. Congress says, no way, Jose, but they partner with local farmers to have them start creating or using their excess rotted crops to create the whiskey. And then also the Congress put in the military directives that every regiment will have a sutler assigned to them. And a sutler was like a merchant. And one of the merchant's jobs was to supply tobacco, whiskey, food, clothing, whatever it was, but they could only work with a single regiment. I didn't know they were this organized on paper, to be honest with you, until doing some of this research. But the sutlers also had to take their pay in IOUs, basically paper money that Congress was issuing, but they had no gold or silver, so it was essentially worthless. But if you wanted to be a sutler, you had to accept the paper money. That was basically IOU money after the war. We'll get you back then. So that became a series of crime, robberies, and scams. It was a disaster, and ultimately Washington's hauled up in Valley Forge. And it's horrible. There's like 20,000 families and kids and soldiers there. People are sick. Smallpox and dysentery and disease would wipe out more of the army than the battle itself. So it was really a dark time, and people lost a lot of faith in Washington. But ultimately, in Benedict Arnold, this guy was a hero. He's a misunderstood guy, except for the whole traitor part. But he'd win the Battle of Saratoga. And this was huge. Thousands of British troops would surrender. And this would motivate and inspire France to now join the war and become our ally. And that's what we needed, because we weren't going to beat the British by ourselves. Even though we were fighting and hiding and running, they had blockades in every port except for Boston, all the way through up until this point in the war. So France getting involved would bring new supplies, ammunition, battery, and arms, and of course, their navy. France gets in, they come, we fight some more. Washington wouldn't fight again. I think from Valley Forge all the way until he marches in to the Battle of Yorktown to claim the victory, where they surrendered to us. There'd be some more battles after, but that essentially would end the Revolutionary War in 1781. And then finally in 1783, we'd sign the Treaty of Paris. The war would be over. Now, during the war, the choking of the rum trade, from taxes to supply to production, was shut down. We had to turn to whiskey. That we had an abundance of whiskey. So American society changed from being a rum-based culture to now whiskey. And so coming out of the war, whiskey would be the way of man in the American colonies, and the rum would be, pushed off to pirates and when we're on vacation in the Caribbean. Whiskey takes over. So the war would change our drinking habits too. And of course, there'd be an abundance of whiskey, an abundance of drinking that would lead to, in the early 1800s, the temperance movement would pop out of nowhere saying, hey, our society is filled with bad people, drug addicts and drunks. We need to do something. But we're not quite there yet. That would last 100 years before they fixed that with prohibition in the 1900s, which didn't help. So now this is our foundation of how important alcohol was in the Revolutionary War. Now, what about drugs? Opium, particularly. So we were getting a lot of our opium from the British, right? They controlled the global opium trade. Like, they had it all from India. And the East India Company was the one just sending opium all over the world. So, and it was pretty common back then. You didn't need to get it from a doctor. There was a drink called laudanum that was invented in the middle 1600s. That was alcohol mixed with opium, right? And opium, if you don't know what opium is, it's heroin. It's opiates. It's Percocet. It's Vicodin. It's fentanyl. It's all the things we have opiate epidemics about, right? Opium comes from the poppy plant. You slice it, a goo comes out. In that goo are the alkaloids of opium and morphine, and then like several other alkaloids, but not as prevalent, but powerful. And at the time, researchers, there was no scientists isolating molecules out of there. That wouldn't happen until 1804, which is pretty amazing it did, where they eventually were able to isolate the morphine from the opium. And then ultimately at the end of that century, they would isolate the other alkaloids, which would lead to things like Oxycontin, fentanyl, heroin, all those things. So the opium was everything at this time. It was a powder. They would make it into gum. It'd be a liquid. They turn it into a liquid and mix it with alcohol, or they dose you with the liquid version, or just a scoop of powder chased by something. So in these medical facilities that were popping up in the Revolutionary War, Dr. Benjamin Rush would be the Surgeon General, basically, of the Middle Army out of the Philadelphia area. And his job was to make sure supplies and the right people were in place. And he worked with somebody on the Leititz Pharmacopoeia. And that was basically a medical journal that said, hey, here's 83 things and here's how to treat it. Anything to do with pain, which is probably everything in a war, or dysentery, because opium also stopped you from going to the bathroom all the time, right? It constipated you. So they wrote to dose a soldier 2 to 4 times an hour with opium when needed for pain. That's almost every injury. Now, what I was able to identify was that the bigger hospitals would have 400 to 600 patients at any time in them, right? People would come in, they'd come out, but like 40% of them were long-term because of severe injuries or sickness, and they would be there 6 months, 12 months, maybe a little more. So if you're in there that long and you're following the medical instructions of dosing them 2 to 4 times an hour, guess what happens? Well, after a week or so in there, 2 weeks in there, you are now addicted to the opium you got. So this is where the records go to a dead end, right? We cannot see which soldiers turned into opium addicts in the Revolutionary War, but knowing what we know from the Civil War, definitely go watch the episode on it. It's fascinating that we did create opiate addicts by the hundreds of thousands. It was a disaster. So that same practice was in place here in the Revolutionary War hospitals. So you have to use your critical thinking to assume pretty fairly that a lot of people were getting addicted to opium. We don't know the problems that it caused because Dr. Benjamin Rush also was famous for, well, he's famous for being a quack because he bled and purged and used mercury and everything. And it was pretty dangerous gambit, to be honest with you. A lot of people died, but he was also the first doctor to study like the psychology of the mind. So let's get into Dr. Benjamin Rush. Yeah, so he would start studying people for like PTSD, which they didn't call it then. He would see the anxiety and depression and the shaking and mania, and he would call it hysteria that soldiers were getting from just being in war. And he had some pretty good breakthrough thoughts of diseases of the mind. Okay, so much that in the early 1800s, he wrote a book, Diseases of the Mind, which was really important in this research because the fact of what he writes in this book puts the exclamation point on, based on the dosing processes in the hospitals of the Revolutionary War, that too much opium causes addiction and it's bad. Because in Diseases of the Mind, his book, he writes just that. In fact, he now hates opium because he said in his time and experience over the core parts of his career, he had seen what opium does to a man and it makes them go crazy. And that's basically the way he described it. And not, he wasn't so eloquent, but you know what I mean? That's the way he described it. So when you're reading about his thoughts on opium and it was informed by his own practices and experiences in the Revolutionary War, it kind of ends that circle. So we can say that opium obviously was prevalent. We know that for a fact. But the dosing schedule caused addiction. He got to experience it, witness it, and see it. So he basically said, hey, here's a warning. This stuff is bad. Okay, well, you know what? Good job. But maybe future generations won't have an opiate problem. Not the case. The same thing would happen in the Civil War. The same thing would happen in the Opium Wars with China and the Crimean War. Everybody would be out in arms. This stuff is bad. What are we doing? And then ultimately, we know what happens in America in the 1990s and early 2000s and to today, that we have a huge opiate epidemic problem in this country. But people have been blowing the whistle for hundreds of years. So to say we had no knowledge of this stuff, it just always irks me. But whatever, we're not talking about that today. So we knew the quantities of opium they had too, because in the medical military records and the naval records and the privateers records, Congress in the early part of the war said it was okay to be a pirate. They set up privateers, and there is a recorded 1,000 incidents all the way from the coast of America to the Caribbean and out even towards Europe, where we were sending pirates out to capture rum, how appropriate, medical supplies, money, food, whatever it was. Congress gave the rubber stamp that it was okay in the future of America that you guys stole and robbed and killed people for these supplies because we need them. But anyways, as that stuff translated into the military inventory and medical records, every regiment was to have 2 to 4 pounds of opium by powder, then a certain amount of ounces by gum, and then pounds by laudanum, the liquid in which you put the opium in with alcohol. So based on the abundance of the supply, the dosing instructions in the pharmacopoeia, and the exclamation point of Dr. Benjamin Rush saying, wait a second, this was all bad and wrong. It's something that should be looked into further, is what I actually believe from doing this research. So somebody with a lot more knowledge, experience, and team should get on this because this is very interesting. Why? Well, it's not going to change anything, but looking back at history, understanding and uncover things just helps improve the way we think and teach and talk about things in the future. Obviously, nobody did it, or else we wouldn't have opiate epidemics, but every culture has seen that. So let's button up the Revolutionary War. Eventually, we win. We signed the Treaty of Paris. George Washington, as we know, becomes commander-in-chief, because he was commander-in-chief. Now he's commander-in-chief, the president. He didn't want to be a king. But here's something ironic and funny. Guess what happens? Guess what Congress and Washington all agree after the war? We're broke. We need money. Hey, that sounds very familiar. Wasn't the crown broke after their war? Hey, how are we going to get money? He's like, I got an idea. With all the abundance of whiskey and all the farmers growing it in Pennsylvania, I'll tell you what, let's tax the whiskey. What? Say what? Like, why? We just went to war. What? I just told you in the beginning how the Revolutionary War started. And now the man, the myth, the legend, GW, yes, he taxes whiskey. In the 1790s, we would have the Whiskey Rebellion in the beginning and the birth of America, caused by taxing alcohol to get revenues for a government. Sounds familiar? That's another episode. Hey, thanks for checking out History on Drugs.